Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back, way back, about 1,000 years or so, to a time when winter wasn't just an excuse for cozy sweaters and pumpkin spice lattes. You're trudging through knee-deep mud, the kind that sucks at your worn leather shoes, or maybe just wrapped rags, and the air bites at your exposed skin like tiny, frozen teeth. Your breath hangs in front of you like a ghostly little cloud, instantly dissipating into the biting wind that whips across the open fields. Imagine a world without central heating, without double-paned windows, without even a decent chimney for most folks. Just you, a flimsy hut, and the relentless, bone-chilling cold that creeps into every corner. You probably wouldn't survive a single medieval winter night without some serious help, let alone an entire season. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are a medieval peasant. Your life revolves around the seasons, and none looms larger, more menacingly, than winter. It's not just cold, it's a force of nature designed, it seems, specifically to test your absolute limits. The sun is a pale, weak disk in the sky, offering little warmth before dipping below the horizon, plunging the world into long, dark nights. The ground beneath your feet is often frozen solid, making travel difficult and backbreaking labor impossible. This is the reality for the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe, not the knights in shining armor or the ladies in silken gowns, but the farmers, the laborers, the ones whose hands were constantly in the dirt. And for these folks, winter was less a picturesque season and more a prolonged battle for survival. The sheer intensity of the cold could be staggering. We're talking temperatures that would plummet well below freezing, often for weeks on end. And remember, insulation wasn't exactly a high-tech industry back then. Your home, which we'll get to in a bit, was permeable, drafty, and offered only a marginal barrier against the elements. The wind seemed to find every crack and crevice, whistling through the flimsy walls and snatching away any precious warmth you managed to generate. It's the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making your joints ache and your fingers and toes feel perpetually numb. Forget heated blankets or even thick socks. You're lucky if you have enough rough wool to wrap yourself in. This wasn't just discomfort, it was dangerous. Exposure was a constant threat. Falling asleep slightly damp or in a drafty spot could easily lead to hypothermia. The elderly, the very young, and the infirm were particularly vulnerable, their bodies less able to regulate temperature and fight off the effects of the cold. It's a mainstream historical fact that mortality rates often spiked during the winter months in medieval communities. It was a brutal culling, a stark reminder of how fragile life was when you were living right on the edge of nature's whims. Think about your daily tasks. Even simple things become monumental challenges. Fetching water means breaking through ice on the well or stream. Gathering firewood requires slogging through snow or frozen mud, your hands quickly becoming numb and clumsy. Animal care involves protecting livestock from the cold and ensuring they have enough food and water, tasks that are far more arduous in freezing conditions. There's no popping down to the corner shop for supplies if you run out. Your survival depends entirely on what you manage to store before the cold set in. And it wasn't just the physical cold. The darkness was oppressive. With limited sources of artificial light, maybe a sputtering candle if you were lucky, or just the glow of the fire, the nights felt interminably long. The world outside your small dwelling became a vast, black unknown, filled with imagined dangers. This psychological burden, combined with the physical discomfort and the constant gnawing anxiety about resources running out, added another layer to the hardship of winter. Historians still argue whether there were specific Little Ice Age periods within the medieval era that made winters even more severe than typical, but there's no debate that the average medieval winter was significantly harsher than what most people in developed countries experience today. Records, where they exist, speak of frozen rivers that could bear carts, and snowfalls so heavy they blocked roads for weeks. Imagine being isolated in your small village, cut off from the outside world by impassable snowdrifts. Your survival depends entirely on the resources within your immediate community. A quirky tidbit? Some medieval texts mention people using animal fat or lard rubbed onto their skin as a form of insulation or protection against the wind. It sounds a bit greasy, maybe not the best for your complexion, but hey, when it's freezing, you try anything, right? It's a far cry from our modern thermal underwear and insulated jackets. Their solutions were simple, often crude, and born purely out of necessity and what was available. This wasn't just about enduring discomfort. It was about innovating, adapting, and relying on the few resources you had. Every decision, from where you built your home to how you stored your food, was influenced by the looming threat of winter. It shaped architecture, farming practices, social structures, and even daily routines. You didn't just survive winter, you lived around it, constantly preparing, constantly mitigating its dangers. Your entire year's rhythm was dictated by the need to get through these lean, cold months. The summer and autumn were a frantic race against time to harvest, preserve, and stock up, knowing that failure meant facing starvation and freezing when the snow began to fall. It put a whole new spin on the phrase, "Winter is coming." For a medieval peasant, it wasn't just a dramatic plot point. It was the most terrifying certainty of their year. Okay, so you're a medieval peasant, shivering through a brutal winter. Where do you even try to escape that bone-deep chill? Your home. Now, forget everything you know about modern housing, even a simple shed. Your dwelling is, well, let's just say it's more of a suggestion of shelter than a solid barrier against the elements. The vast majority of medieval peasants lived in structures that were incredibly basic, built from whatever materials were readily available in the local area. We're talking wood, mud, straw, reeds, maybe some stone if you were lucky enough to live near a quarry, but mostly, it was earth and plants. Imagine building your house primarily out of woven sticks and mud. That's wattle and daub for you. You'd set up a frame of wooden posts, then weave smaller branches or reeds, the wattle, between them to create a kind of lattice. Then, you'd mix together clay, mud, straw, animal dung, and water to create the daub, which was then plastered over the wattle, both inside and out. Sounds rustic, right? It dried into a reasonably hard surface, but it was far from impermeable. Cracks would form as it dried or shifted, and rain could eventually wash it away, requiring constant maintenance. It wasn't exactly built for energy efficiency standards, let's put it that way. You'd feel the wind whistling through gaps you didn't even know existed, like the house was sighing with the cold right along with you. The roof was almost always thatched. Bundles of straw, reeds, or sometimes heather were layered thickly over a wooden frame. Thatch can be surprisingly good insulation when done well and kept in good repair. But it's also a haven for vermin, mice, rats, insects, and it's a terrifying fire risk, especially with an open fire burning constantly inside. A spark landing on the dry thatch could turn your meager home into an inferno in minutes. And when it rained or snowed heavily, a poorly maintained thatch roof could leak, adding damp misery to the cold. You might wake up with drips landing on your face, pooling on the dirt floor. Ah yes, the floor. In most peasant homes, the floor was just packed earth. Cold, hard, and often damp, especially if the ground beneath was wet or if rain managed to get in. Some people might spread fresh rushes or straw over the floor for a bit of cushioning and warmth, but these quickly became dirty, damp, and infested with fleas and other creepy crawlies. Walking barefoot was probably not an option unless you wanted frostbite or a nasty infection. It's a far cry from underfloor heating, or even just a nice rug. The cold seemed to radiate up from the very ground beneath you. Windows were a luxury, and glass was practically unheard of for peasants. If you had windows at all, they were usually just small openings, perhaps with a wooden shutter that you'd close in bad weather, plunging the interior into near total darkness. Sometimes, a piece of stretched animal hide or linen soaked in fat might be used to let in a little diffused light while keeping some of the wind out, but it wasn't transparent and offered minimal insulation. So you had a choice: light and cold drafts, or darkness and slightly less cold drafts. Modern double glazing seems like something out of a fairy tale. And the door? Usually a simple wooden affair, often hung on leather hinges or simple metal loops. It rarely fit snugly in its frame. Another constant source of drafts, letting in icy tendrils of air every time someone went in or out. You could probably stand by the door and get a pretty good idea of the wind speed outside just from the breeze blowing in. It makes you appreciate a well-sealed front door, doesn't it? Perhaps the most significant difference from modern homes was the lack of a chimney in many early medieval peasant dwellings. The fire, which was the absolute center of life and warmth, burned on an open hearth, often in the middle of the single-room dwelling. The smoke was expected to find its way out through a hole in the roof, a smoke hole, or simply filter through the thatch and the gaps in the walls. This meant the inside of your home was constantly filled with smoke. Your eyes would sting, your lungs would ache, and everything, your clothes, your hair, the walls, would be coated in a layer of soot. While the smoke did help preserve the thatch roof and might deter some insects, it was incredibly unhealthy to breathe constantly. Historians still argue about how common proper smoke hoods or rudimentary chimneys were in peasant homes across different periods and regions, but it's clear that smoky interiors were a widespread reality. The typical peasant house was usually small, often just one room that served as living area, kitchen, and bedroom for the entire family. There might be a partition or two made of cloth or wood for a bit of privacy, but mostly, you were all together in one space. This layout, while cramped, did have one advantage in the cold body heat. With everyone huddled together, plus maybe some livestock, which we'll talk about later, the combined body heat could make a noticeable difference in the ambient temperature of the small space. It was cozy in the sense of being crowded, not necessarily comfortable. It's like a perpetual slumber party where everyone smells faintly of smoke and damp earth. A mainstream historical fact is that wattle and daub construction was the predominant building technique for peasant homes across much of medieval Europe due to the availability and low cost of materials. It was quick to erect, though required frequent repairs. A quirky tidbit is that the smoke-filled interiors might have had an unexpected benefit beyond preserving the thatch. The creosote buildup on the inside of the roof likely helped to deter wood-boring insects, potentially extending the life of the roof timbers. So you traded respiratory health for structural integrity, a classic medieval compromise. Living in such a dwelling during winter meant you were in a constant, low-level battle against the cold and damp. The walls offered minimal insulation, the roof could leak, the floor was freezing, and drafts were everywhere. The air inside, thick with smoke, might be slightly warmer than the air outside, but it was still far from comfortable or healthy. This wasn't a place designed for lounging or relaxation. It was a functional shelter, a place to huddle by the fire and try not to freeze. It highlights just how dependent medieval peasants were on that central hearth, because the structure itself was doing very little heavy lifting when it came to keeping you warm. You were essentially living in a very leaky, very smoky box made of dirt and sticks. And getting through the night in that box when the temperature dropped below freezing required more than just thick walls. It required ingenuity, resilience, and making the absolute most of the few resources you had. Okay, so you're in that leaky, smoky box of a house, and the cold is trying its best to seep into your very soul. What's your main defense? What's the absolute heart, the lifeblood, the literal warmth of this entire operation? It's the fire. Forget your modern central heating thermostat. Your survival hinges entirely on that flickering, hungry flame burning on the hearth, usually right there in the middle of your single room. This isn't just a convenience, it is everything. Imagine it, the long, dark, freezing night has fallen. Outside, the wind howls like a hungry wolf, and the world is a symphony of creaks and groans from the stressed timbers and whistling drafts. Inside, the only light, the only real warmth, emanates from that pile of burning logs. You and your family are huddled as close as you dare, the heat scorching your front, while the cold still nips at your back. The air is thick with smoke. Remember that smoke hole we talked about in the roof? It's trying its best, bless its heart, but a lot of the smoke is just hanging around, stinging your eyes and making you cough. Everything smells of wood smoke, all the time. Your clothes, your hair, the meager food you're cooking, the very air you breathe. It's the scent of survival. This fire isn't just for heat, although that's its most critical function in winter. It's also your kitchen. A pot might be suspended over the flames from a hook or rest on stones nestled among the embers. This is where your porridge simmers, your meager stew bubbles, the only source of cooked food. No ovens, no stovetops, just the open fire. This means cooking is a constant negotiation with the flames. Too hot and your food burns, too cool and it just sits there stubbornly refusing to get warm. And trying to cook anything more complex than boiling or stewing requires serious skill and patience. Baking bread, for instance, might involve heating stones in the fire and then baking the dough on or around them, or using a covered pot placed directly in the embers. It's a far cry from preheating your electric oven to 350 degrees. And then there's the light. As soon as the sun dips below the horizon, your world shrinks to the radius illuminated by the fire's glow. Maybe you have a rushlight, a dried rush dipped in animal fat, sputtering away, adding a bit of smoky light. Or if you're relatively well off, a tallow candle, made from animal fat, again, because beeswax was expensive. But mostly, your evenings are spent in the dim, flickering light of the hearth. This isn't enough light for detailed work or reading, even if you could read, which is unlikely. It's enough to see the faces of your family, to avoid tripping over the furniture, what little there is, and to perform simple tasks like mending clothes or preparing food for the next day. The darkness presses in on the edges of the light, making the small space feel both cozy and slightly vulnerable. The fire is a demanding master, though. It requires constant feeding. Fuel is a perpetual concern, especially in winter. Wood is the primary fuel source, and gathering it is hard, often dangerous work. You'd spend days in the woods, chopping, hauling, and stacking logs, racing against the arrival of snow and frozen ground. Every piece of wood is precious. You can't just turn up the dial. You have to manage your fuel supply carefully, burning only what's necessary to keep from freezing. Running out of firewood in the depth of winter? That's a death sentence. It's a constant, low-level anxiety. Do we have enough wood to get through the week? The month? Until spring? And the smoke, oh, the smoke. Historians still argue whether rudimentary chimneys or smoke hoods were more common in peasant homes across different regions and time periods than the simple roof hole, but it's clear that smoky interiors were a widespread reality. The smoke didn't just sting your eyes, it coated your lungs. Chronic respiratory problems were likely common. It's a harsh trade-off, warmth and the ability to cook, at the cost of breathing air thick with soot and chemicals. It makes you appreciate opening a window for fresh air, something you probably wouldn't do much in a medieval winter. A quirky tidbit about medieval fires is that peat was also commonly used as fuel in areas where wood was scarce, particularly in boggy regions like parts of Ireland or Scotland. Peat burns slowly and produces a lot of heat, but it also creates a very distinctive, pungent smoke. So, depending on where you lived, your home might have smelled less like a cozy campfire and more like, well, burning bog. Delicious. The open hearth wasn't just functional, it was the social hub of the home. It was the warmest spot, the place where the family gathered after a long day. This is where stories were told, where simple games were played, where people talked and shared the day's worries and small triumphs. It was the heart, not just for warmth, but for community within the family unit. It's where you felt safest, huddled together against the vast, cold darkness outside. A mainstream historical fact is that the open hearth remained the primary method for heating and cooking in most peasant homes throughout the medieval period, with more advanced chimney structures becoming more common in wealthier homes and later periods. Its centrality wasn't just about technology. It reflected the fundamental needs and resources available to the vast majority of the population. Despite its life-giving properties, the fire was also a constant danger. A stray spark could ignite the dry thatch roof in an instant, turning your home into a raging inferno in minutes. Living with an open fire in a structure made of wood, straw, and mud required extreme caution. You couldn't leave it unattended for long, especially at night. The fear of fire was a constant, low-level hum beneath the fear of cold and starvation. It's a bit like trying to stay warm by cuddling a dragon, incredibly effective, but also potentially fatal. So, the hearth fire. It's your heater, your stove, your lamp, and a gathering place for your family. It demands fuel, fills your home with smoke, and constantly threatens to burn everything down. But without it, you simply wouldn't survive the winter night. It is the beating, fiery heart of your struggle against the cold, the thing you tend with the utmost care, because its failure means your end. You live by the grace of that flame, huddling close, breathing the smoky air, and praying you have enough wood to see the morning. Okay, so you're huddled by that smoky, life-giving fire in your drafty, earthen house. The heat is hitting your front, but you can still feel the chill trying to sneak in from the back and the floor. Even with the fire, you need something on you to keep that precious body heat from escaping into the abyss. Forget your fleece-lined leggings and thermal underwear. Your medieval wardrobe is functional. Very, very functional. Your primary defense against the cold, besides the fire and maybe sharing body heat with a pig, is layers. Layers of simple, rough fabric. The closest thing you have to modern underwear is likely a basic linen shift or tunic worn directly against your skin. Linen is made from the flax plant, and it's relatively smooth and easier to wash than wool, though. Easier to wash in medieval winter means slightly less impossible to clean. Remember, fetching water means breaking ice, and drying clothes takes forever in damp, cold air. So, this linen layer is probably doing double or triple duty between washes, picking up the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and whatever else you've encountered during your day. It's not exactly luxurious, but it provides a basic barrier. Over this linen layer, you wear your main garment, a tunic, likely made of wool. Wool is the superstar of medieval peasant clothing for a reason. It's warm, even when damp, and it's readily available if you have access to sheep, or can trade for fleece or finished cloth. But this isn't the soft merino wool you find in hiking socks today. This is coarse, scratchy stuff. Imagine wearing a blanket made of steel wool. Okay, maybe not that bad, but definitely not something you choose for comfort. It itches. It sheds. It smells faintly of sheep, especially when it gets damp. But boy, does it hold warmth. Your wool tunic might be knee-length or longer, belted at the waist. The thicker the wool, the warmer it is, but also the heavier and more expensive, or harder to produce yourself. Depending on the weather and what you're doing, you might add more layers. Another wool tunic, perhaps? Maybe a simple cloak or mantle, again likely wool, fastened at the shoulder with a pin or tie. This cloak is your outer shell, your windbreaker, your extra blanket when you're trying to sleep. It's probably heavy and cumbersome, but essential for facing the elements outside your flimsy dwelling. For your legs, you might wear simple cloth leggings or hoses tied onto your belt or a padded garment around your waist. Again, wool is preferred for warmth. These aren't fitted tights, they're more like loose tubes of fabric. Keeping your lower extremities warm is crucial, especially when you're slogging through mud or snow. And then there are your feet. Oh, your poor, cold feet. Your footwear is probably the weakest link in your cold defense. Simple leather shoes or boots, often just tied on, were common. These offer minimal insulation and zero waterproofing. Your feet are likely perpetually cold and damp. You might wrap rags or straw around your feet before putting on your shoes, a simple trick to add a tiny bit of insulation and padding. It's not much, but every little bit helps when frostbite is a real concern. Imagine the feeling of icy water seeping through your worn leather sole onto your straw-wrapped foot. Blissful, right? It makes you appreciate waterproof hiking boots in a whole new way. On your head, you'd likely wear a coif, a close-fitting linen cap, and over that, perhaps a wool hood attached to your cloak or a separate cap. Keeping your head warm is vital, as a lot of heat is lost there. Plus, the coif helps keep your hair out of your face and offers a tiny bit of protection from the ever-present smoke and soot inside the house. The key to surviving in these basic clothes is layering, as we mentioned. You pile on everything you own. There's no concept of specific, indoor, or outdoor, clothing in the way we think of it. You wear variations of the same garments all the time, adding or removing layers as needed, though in winter, removing layers is probably a rare event. Your clothes are your constant companion, your portable shelter. They get dirty, they get damp, they smell, they itch, but they are what stands between you and the deadly cold when you step away from the fire. Washing clothes, especially the thick woolens, is a major undertaking and often deferred during the coldest months. Water is hard to come by and freezing cold, and drying takes forever. So, your clothes accumulate the grime and smells of winter life: smoke, sweat, animal odors, damp earth. It's not exactly a fresh and clean vibe. You probably got used to the perpetual faint aroma of damp sheep and wood smoke clinging to everything. Trying to get a good night's sleep wrapped in scratchy, smelly, slightly damp wool is an experience that really puts modern comfort into perspective. Does this duvet have a thread count of 800? Is not a question you'd ever ponder. It's more like, is this itchy enough to distract me from the cold? A mainstream historical fact about medieval peasant clothing is that wool was by far the most common material for outer garments across most of Europe due to its warmth, durability, and the widespread availability of sheep. Linen was typically used for undergarments because it was smoother against the skin and easier to clean, though still a relative luxury compared to rough wool. Historians still argue whether peasant clothing was primarily homespun and made within the household or village, or if there was a more significant trade network where peasants purchased finished cloth or garments from markets or traveling peddlers. The reality likely varied greatly depending on the region, time period, and the individual peasant family's resources and access to markets. But regardless of where it came from, the basic materials and styles remained remarkably consistent for centuries due to practicality and cost. A quirky tidbit is that peasants might dye their wool clothing using natural dyes made from local plants, giving their otherwise simple garments colors like muted browns, greens, yellows, or reddish browns. So, while not fancy, their wardrobe wasn't necessarily just undyed, drab wool, though bright, vibrant colors were much harder to achieve and usually reserved for the wealthy. Imagine painstakingly gathering plants and preparing dyes just to make your perpetually itchy tunic a slightly less boring shade of brown. That's dedication. Your clothing is a precious asset, not something you discard. It's mended constantly. Patches cover holes, seams are restitched. A garment might last for years, even decades, being passed down or refashioned. The idea of fast fashion or a seasonal wardrobe is utterly alien. You have what you have, and you make it last through sheer necessity and constant repair. It's a testament to resourcefulness, or maybe just the fact that you couldn't afford anything else. So, dressed in your layers of rough linen and scratchy wool, with rags stuffed in your shoes and smoke in your hair, you face the medieval winter. Your clothes are a second skin, a crucial line of defense against the relentless cold. They aren't comfortable by modern standards, they smell, they itch, and they require constant care. But without them, even the life-giving hearth fire wouldn't be enough to see you through the long, freezing nights. You are literally wrapped in the products of the land and your own labor, hoping it's enough to keep the bone chill at bay. So, you're layered up in scratchy wool, breathing smoky air by the fire in your drafty home, and you've managed not to freeze overnight. Great. But warmth isn't the only thing you need to survive the long winter. You also need to eat. And let me tell you, the medieval peasant diet wasn't exactly a year-round buffet. Winter was the season of scarcity, the time when fresh food vanished, and you relied entirely on what you had managed to gather and preserve during the warmer, more abundant months. This wasn't just stocking a pantry. It was a desperate race against time and decay, knowing that failure meant hunger, weakness, and increased vulnerability to the cold and disease. Think about the bounty of summer and autumn. The fields yielded grain, the garden offered vegetables, the forests might provide nuts and berries, and if you were lucky, maybe a pig or a few chickens. But these things spoil quickly. You couldn't just pop them in the fridge or freezer, obviously. So, medieval peasants developed ingenious, if sometimes crude, methods to make food last through the lean winter months. These techniques were centuries old, born out of necessity, and they formed the backbone of your winter survival strategy. One of the most crucial methods was salting. Salt was like liquid gold in the medieval world, not just for seasoning, but as a vital preservative. Meat, especially pork, a peasant staple, was heavily salted. You'd butcher the animal, rub coarse salt deep into the flesh, layer it in barrels or chests, and cover it completely with more salt. The salt drew out the moisture, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. This salted meat would last for months, providing essential protein during the winter when fresh meat was impossible to come by unless you managed to hunt or trap something, which was often forbidden on the Lord's land anyway. Eating heavily salted meat day after day wasn't exactly a culinary delight. It would be incredibly salty, requiring soaking before cooking, but it kept you alive. Imagine the constant thirst from that diet. You'd probably drink enough water to float a small boat. Smoking was another popular technique, often used in conjunction with salting, especially for meat and fish, if you lived near a river or coast and had fishing rights. Meat would be hung in the smoky upper reaches of the house, often directly above the hearth, or in a dedicated smokehouse if the village had one. The smoke contained compounds that inhibited bacterial growth, and the drying effect also helped preserve the food. Everything in your house already smelled of smoke anyway, so adding the aroma of smoking ham or fish probably just blended into the background. It's the original air freshener, ode to wood smoke and cured pork. Drying was perhaps the simplest method, relying purely on removing moisture. Grains like wheat, barley, and oats were the most important dried foods, stored dry and cool to prevent spoilage and weevil infestation. These formed the absolute foundation of your diet, ground into flour for bread or cooked as porridge. Legumes like peas and beans were also dried. Vegetables like onions and some root vegetables might be stored in cool, dry pits or cellars, but they wouldn't last all winter. Fruits were sometimes dried, like apples or berries, but these were more of a treat than a dietary staple for most peasants. Herbs were also dried for flavoring and medicinal purposes. Drying is simple, but it requires the right conditions, not too damp, not too hot, and constant vigilance against pests. Dairy products were much harder to preserve. Milk couldn't be kept fresh for long. Butter could be made and might last a little while, especially in cooler conditions, but cheese was the primary way to preserve milk. Hard cheeses could last for months if stored properly. Eggs were a seasonal luxury. Chickens laid far less in winter. The success of your winter survival hinged entirely on how much you managed to produce and preserve before the cold set in. A poor harvest, a pest infestation, or unexpected early frost could decimate your food stores before winter even truly began. You were constantly monitoring your supplies, calculating how long they would last, stretching them thinner and thinner as the weeks dragged on. There was no guarantee you'd have enough. Hunger wasn't just an unpleasant feeling. It was a constant, gnawing fear that sat in the pit of your stomach from the moment the leaves started to turn. Storing these precious supplies also presented challenges. You needed dry, secure places. Grain might be kept in sacks or chests, hopefully elevated off the damp earth floor. Salted meat barrels would be heavy and bulky. Every storage container was a potential target for rats, mice, weevils, and other pests, which could ruin months of hard work in a matter of days. Keeping pests out was a never-ending battle, often involving cats, if you had one, and constant vigilance. Imagine defending your winter food supply from a horde of determined mice. It's like a tiny, furry, high-stakes siege every night. Beyond pests, there was also the risk of spoilage if the preservation methods weren't perfect. Meat could go rancid, dried goods could become moldy or infested. You didn't have the luxury of discarding food because it was slightly past its prime. You ate it unless it was absolutely inedible, risking sickness. The line between edible and dangerous was probably a lot blurrier than we're used to. A mainstream historical fact is that grain, primarily wheat, barley, and oats, formed the absolute staple of the medieval peasant diet across most of Europe, providing the bulk of their calories. Its ability to be dried and stored for long periods was essential for winter survival. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically had enough protein and fat in their winter diets, which relied heavily on stored grains and legumes, with salted meat being a less frequent and often heavily processed addition. The quality and nutritional value of their stored food likely varied greatly depending on the harvest, their resources, and their ability to preserve food effectively. A quirky tidbit? In some regions, particularly those with access to peat bogs, butter might be preserved by burying it in the bog. The anaerobic, acidic conditions of the bog help prevent spoilage, and while it imparted a unique flavor, sometimes described as bog butter, it was an effective way to store a valuable foodstuff. So, your dairy might literally come from the ground, preserved in ancient mud. Delicious? Probably not, but effective. The process of stocking up wasn't just about the physical labor of harvesting and preserving. It was a psychological preparation for the lean times ahead. Every filled sack of grain, every barrel of salted meat, every bundle of dried herbs was a small victory against the looming threat of starvation. It was a constant reminder of your dependence on the land and the unpredictable nature of the weather. You lived in a state of perpetual anxiety about your winter stores, counting the days until spring when fresh food might once again become available. Surviving winter wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about having enough calories to fuel your body, enough nutrients to fight off illness, and enough hope that your meager stores would last until the earth thawed again. Okay, so you've managed to squirrel away your precious winter stores, the grain, the salted meat, the dried peas and beans, maybe a few sad-looking root vegetables buried in a pit. You've won the first battle against winter by not letting your food rot or get eaten by mice. Remember that tiny, furry siege we talked about? But now comes the next challenge, actually eating this stuff, day in and day out, for months on end. Forget variety, forget flavor in the modern sense. Your winter fare is about one thing and one thing only, survival. It's fuel, pure and simple, and it tastes mostly of grain, salt, smoke, and desperation. The absolute cornerstone of your winter diet, the thing that provides the bulk of your calories and keeps you from starving, is grain. Wheat if you are relatively lucky, but more likely barley or oats. This grain is usually ground into flour, but in the winter, the most common way to consume it is as porridge. Think of it as the medieval peasant superfood, monotonous, bland, but utterly essential. You'd boil your grain, maybe cracked or roughly ground, in water or perhaps weak ale, safer than water sometimes, stirring it over the fire for a long, long time until it became a thick, gray, gloopy mass. This would be your breakfast, your lunch, and often a significant part of your dinner. Day after day. Week after week. Months after month. Imagine eating oatmeal for literally every meal. For 3 months straight. With no sugar, no fruit, maybe just a tiny bit of salt or a dried herb if you were feeling fancy. It's the kind of meal that sticks to your ribs, yes, but also sticks to your soul with its relentless sameness. You probably learned to eat it quickly, just to get it over with. Beyond the ever-present porridge, the other staple dish of winter is the stew. This is where any other available foodstuffs would be thrown into a pot simmering over the hearth. That precious salted meat? It would need to be soaked, often for hours or even overnight, to draw out some of the excess salt. Remember how salty it was? Then it would be added to the pot. Any dried peas or beans would go in, providing much-needed protein and fiber. If you had any root vegetables that had survived storage, perhaps some parsnips, turnips, or leeks, they'd join the party. Maybe a few dried herbs for flavor, though probably not many. The result is a watery, often thin stew, its flavor dominated by the salt and the smoky meat. It's not a rich, hearty stew like you might imagine from a fantasy novel. It's thin, functional, and designed to stretch the limited ingredients as far as possible. A single, small piece of salted pork might flavor a pot of watery broth and beans for the entire family for a couple of days. It's less a meal, more a warm, liquid delivery system for calories. Bread was also eaten, of course, but winter bread was often made from the coarser grains, sometimes mixed with legumes or even acorns in times of real scarcity. It would be heavy, dense, and probably quite hard, especially after a day or two. Toasting it by the fire would be one way to make it more palatable, and maybe soften it enough not to break your teeth. Imagine trying to dunk that into your watery stew. It might just absorb the entire bowl. Fresh food was a distant memory. No fresh vegetables, no fresh fruit, unless you had some hearty, late-season apples that somehow survived storage for a bit. This lack of fresh produce meant a severe lack of vitamins, particularly vitamin C. While scurvy is often associated with sailors, medieval peasants weren't immune, especially during long, harsh winters when their diet was almost entirely dried grains and salted meat. You'd feel the effects: lethargy, aching joints, maybe bleeding gums. Your body was just trying to limp through on minimal nutrition. Getting enough to eat wasn't just about having food, it was about having enough food. Rations were often meager, especially as winter wore on and supplies dwindled. You were constantly hungry, a dull ache in your stomach that never quite went away. Every meal was carefully portioned out. There were no seconds. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable to malnutrition, their bodies less able to cope with the lack of calories and nutrients. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically consumed enough calories and had a sufficiently balanced diet, especially during winter, to maintain good health and energy levels for the demanding physical labor required of them when spring finally arrived. The answer likely varied hugely based on the success of the previous harvest and the wealth, or lack thereof, of the individual family and village. Beyond the staples, there might be occasional additions if you were very lucky. Perhaps you managed to catch a rabbit or trap a bird, though hunting was often forbidden on the Lord's land. Maybe you had a few chickens that still laid the odd egg, though they laid far less in winter. These were rare treats, not regular parts of the diet. Your meals were predictable, repetitive, and designed purely for sustenance. A mainstream historical fact is that cereals, grain, provided 60 to 80% of the calories in the typical medieval peasant diet, making porridge and bread the absolute core of their food intake year-round, but especially in winter when other options were scarce. A quirky tidbit about winter fare is the use of pottage, which was essentially a thick soup or stew made from whatever was available: grains, vegetables, legumes, sometimes a little meat or fat. It was often cooked continuously over the fire, with new ingredients added daily, making it a kind of perpetual stew. It saved fuel and effort, but you can imagine the flavors might get complex over time. Imagine having a pot simmering for a week, just adding leftovers. Sounds efficient? Maybe not delicious. The monotony of the winter diet wasn't just boring, it was psychologically draining. The lack of variety, the constant feeling of hunger, the knowledge that this was all you had until spring, it wore you down. Food is more than just fuel. It's comfort, it's pleasure, it's social. For medieval peasants in winter, it was primarily just fuel, and often not quite enough of that. You dreamed of the first fresh greens of spring, the first berries, the possibility of fresh meat. Those dreams helped get you through the long, cold nights, sitting by the fire, eating yet another bowl of grey porridge, hoping your meager stores would last. So you're surviving on porridge, salty stew, and the constant low thrum of hunger. You're layered up and scratchable by the smoky fire. But even all that might not be enough to keep the bitter cold at bay, especially on the absolute coldest nights. Medieval peasants had another trick up their sleeve, one that might seem a little unconventional by modern standards. They shared their homes. And I don't just mean with their extended family. I mean with their livestock. Yes, you heard that right. Your fellow inhabitants, the ones contributing significantly to the overall warmth of your drafty, smoky dwelling, might include pigs, chickens, maybe a goat, and if you were particularly fortunate, or maybe unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, even an ox or a cow. This wasn't just some quaint tradition. It was a pragmatic, necessary survival strategy, especially in the colder regions or during particularly brutal winters. Think of it as biological central heating, powered by snorts, grunts, and clucking. The layout of many peasant homes reflected this integrated lifestyle. Sometimes, the animals would be housed in a section of the main dwelling, perhaps separated by a low wall or partition. In other cases, their shelter might be built directly adjacent to the human living space, sharing a common wall. The idea was to capture the body heat generated by these animals and let it radiate into the area where the humans slept and lived. A pig, for instance, is a surprisingly efficient heat source, especially when huddled together with its litter. A cow or an ox is like a furry, four-legged radiator. You're probably thinking, "Wow, sounds cozy!" And by cozy, I mean warmish, but also incredibly smelly, noisy, and probably crawling with fleas. Imagine trying to sleep while a pig snores in the corner, chickens rustle and cluck on their perch, and the faint, but ever-present, aroma of manure hangs heavy in the smoky air. It adds a whole new dimension to the concept of a full house. Your bedroom companions aren't just siblings or parents, they're also the source of your breakfast eggs and your potential Christmas dinner. It's the ultimate multi-purpose space: kitchen, living room, bedroom, and barn, all rolled into one leaky, drafty structure. You might literally be sharing a floor with animals, separated by nothing more than a change in elevation or a rough wooden barrier. The benefits were undeniable, though. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that the body heat from even a few animals could raise the internal temperature of a small, poorly insulated dwelling by a noticeable degree, perhaps adding a few precious degrees Fahrenheit that could make the difference between shivering misery and outright danger on a freezing night. When the outside temperature is plummeting, every single degree inside counts. It's a stark illustration of how precious and hard-won warmth was. You couldn't just dial up the thermostat. You had to live cheek by jowl with your livestock. Of course, there were significant downsides, beyond the obvious olfactory challenges. Housing animals indoors dramatically increased the problems with hygiene. Animal waste is, well, waste. It attracts flies, other insects, and rodents. The damp, manure-laden environment was a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Remember how we talked about medieval hygiene being challenging even without sharing your home with farm animals? Adding pigs and chickens to the mix certainly didn't improve things. The risk of disease spreading between animals and humans, and among the humans themselves in such close, unsanitary quarters, was significantly higher. It makes you appreciate your separate garage or shed for the lawnmower, let alone a purpose-built barn. You were essentially living in a barn that happened to have a bed in it. The noise would also be a constant factor. Animals aren't exactly quiet neighbors. You'd have the lowing of a cow, the grunting and rooting of pigs, the sudden squawks and clucking of chickens, not to mention the sounds of them moving around, scratching, and generally being animals. Sleep, already difficult due to the cold, the hard floor, the smoke, and the hunger, would be further interrupted by your barnyard roommates. You'd probably develop an impressive ability to sleep through anything, a skill that would serve you well in a loud, chaotic medieval world. Historians still argue whether this practice of housing animals inside the main living space was as widespread throughout the medieval period as some earlier interpretations suggested, or if it became less common over time with improved building techniques like separate byres, animal sheds, or the development of chimneys which allowed the fire to move away from the center of the room. The reality likely varied greatly by region, climate, and the relative wealth of the peasant family, with the poorest and those in the coldest areas being most likely to rely on animal body heat. A mainstream historical fact is that archaeological evidence, such as distinct flooring changes, drainage channels, and even animal remains found within the footprint of medieval peasant houses, supports the idea that livestock were frequently housed in at least part of the dwelling, particularly in the early medieval period and in northern climates. A quirky tidbit is that some building designs in colder regions, like the longhouses found in parts of Scandinavia or the British Isles, specifically incorporated animal stalls at one end of the building, often with a shared roof and sometimes even a shared internal doorway to maximize the transfer of heat to the human living area. It wasn't just an accidental occurrence. It was a deliberate architectural choice driven by the need for warmth. Imagine designing your house specifically so your cow can help heat your bedroom. That's next-level energy efficiency planning. Beyond the practical benefits of warmth, sharing space with animals also offered security. Keeping valuable livestock indoors or very close by protected them from rustlers and wild animals during the night. In a world without locked doors or reliable law enforcement, your animals were your most important asset, representing future food, labor power, if they were oxen or horses, and potential trade goods. Keeping them safe was paramount, and having them under the same roof, or a shared roof, provided peace of mind, even if it cost you a good night's sleep and a pleasant-smelling home. It's a trade-off: better to be safe, warmish, and smelly than cold, robbed, and potentially starving. So, as you huddle by the fire, wrapped in your woolens, listening to the sounds of the night, those grunts and rustles from the corner aren't just noise. They're the sounds of your biological heating system working overtime. They are a reminder that survival in the medieval winter required using every resource available, even if that resource was a slightly smelly pig. It's a testament to the ingenuity and resilience required to make it through, literally sharing your most intimate space with the creatures who helped keep you alive, both through their warmth and, eventually, through their meat. It's not exactly a scene you'll see in a modern home and garden magazine, but for a medieval peasant, it was a crucial part of getting through the coldest nights. So, you're surviving the nights huddled with your family and maybe a few farm animals, wrapped in itchy wool, breathing smoky air, and dreaming of spring greens. But even with the combined body heat of your pig and your spouse, and the meager warmth from the fire, getting through the medieval winter wasn't just about the resilience of the individual household. It was also about the strength of the bonds within your community. Your village wasn't just a collection of drafty huts. It was a lifeline, a network of mutual dependence that could mean the difference between life and death when the cold truly bit down. Think about it, you're all in the same leaky boat, or rather, the same collection of leaky, smoky huts. Everyone faces the same threats: the cold, the hunger, the sickness, the endless darkness. In this world, isolation is a death sentence. If your roof leaks badly, or your firewood runs out unexpectedly early, or someone in your family gets too sick to work, you can't just call a repairman or order groceries online. Your immediate neighbors, the people you see every single day, are your only hope. Village life during winter often meant relying even more heavily on each other. If one family's grain stores were running dangerously low, while another had a slightly better harvest, there might be an expectation, or even a formal village custom, for the better-off family to share. This wasn't necessarily pure altruism. It was also self-preservation. The collapse of one household weakened the entire community, making everyone more vulnerable. You helped your neighbor because you knew that next year, or next week, you might be the one in need. It was a brutal form of social security, built on shared hardship and the understanding that you were all literally in it together. Borrowing and lending, whether it was a sack of grain, a few logs, or a helping hand, was a constant feature of village life, especially when resources were stretched thin. Tasks that were difficult for one family could be managed by the group. Clearing deep snow from paths between houses or to the well, repairing a damaged roof after a winter storm, helping a neighbor whose animal died. These weren't individual burdens. They were communal responsibilities. Imagine trying to dig a path through a massive snowdrift by yourself with just a wooden shovel. Now imagine the whole village turning out. It makes a huge difference. This collaborative effort wasn't just about efficiency. It reinforced those vital social ties. You worked together, you survived together. Beyond the practicalities, there was the psychological support. The long, dark nights, the constant hunger, the pervasive cold, it wore on you. Gathering together, even if it was just a few families huddled around a slightly larger fire in someone's hut, provided crucial morale. This was the time for storytelling, for sharing news and gossip, not that there was much news from outside the village in winter, for singing simple songs, or playing basic games. These communal activities weren't frivolous. They were essential for maintaining spirits, for reminding everyone that they weren't alone in their struggle. Laughter, even born of gallows humor about the cold or the lack of food, was a form of resistance against the crushing weight of winter. Historians still argue whether medieval peasant villages were truly egalitarian, with resources and labor shared relatively equally, or if there were significant internal hierarchies and disparities in wealth and power even among the peasant class. While the shared struggle of winter undoubtedly fostered cooperation, it's likely that some families were always closer to the brink than others, and the dynamics of aid weren't always perfectly balanced. But the fundamental principle of mutual reliance was undeniable. Sometimes, the community bonds were formalized. Many villages had communal ovens for baking bread, saving fuel and effort for individual households. There might be communal tools that families shared. Decisions about planting, harvesting, and even managing shared resources like woodland or pasture were often made communally, requiring cooperation and agreement, or at least, reluctant compliance. Winter was a time when these communal structures were put to the ultimate test. Could the village collectively manage its resources to ensure everyone had at least a basic chance of survival? A quirky tidbit is that some medieval village customs involved communal feasting or sharing special foods during winter festivals, like Christmas or Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, marking the return to work. While resources were scarce, these occasions, even if the food was simple and rationed, were incredibly important for reinforcing community identity, breaking the monotony of the winter diet, and providing a brief moment of shared celebration and hope. Imagine looking forward to that one slightly less watery stew or that slightly nicer loaf of bread for weeks. It's the little things, right? The village priest, if there was one, also played a role, providing spiritual comfort but often also acting as a mediator in disputes, organizing basic forms of poor relief, though resources were minimal, and sometimes being a central figure for communal gatherings and news sharing. The church building itself, often one of the most substantial structures in the village, might serve as a temporary shelter in extreme weather or a gathering place for warmth if a large fire could be built there, though heating churches was difficult and expensive. Living in such close proximity, sharing resources and space, also meant that tensions could flare. Disputes over land, animals, debts, or simply personality clashes were inevitable. Winter, with its stresses of hunger, cold, and confinement, could exacerbate these tensions. You might be relying on your neighbor for help, but you also might be locked in a simmering feud with them. It added another layer of complexity to the already difficult task of survival. It's like a really high-stakes, year-round reality show where the contestants are constantly hungry, cold, and arguing about firewood, and the grand prize is just not dying. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval peasant village was the primary social and economic unit for the vast majority of the population. Life was deeply communal, with individuals' survival and prosperity heavily reliant on the functioning and health of the village as a whole. This was particularly true in winter when individual resources were most likely to fail. Ultimately, surviving the medieval winter wasn't just about your personal grit or the thickness of your wool tunic. It was about the collective strength of your community. It was about the willingness to share, to help, to gather together against the darkness and the cold. You were a single thread in a complex, sometimes fraying, social fabric. And the survival of that fabric, through mutual aid and shared endurance, was as vital to your survival as the fire on your hearth or the grain in your chest. You faced the winter together, hoping that the bonds of community would be strong enough to see everyone through to the spring. So, you've got your biological heating system in the corner, the pigs snoring, the chickens rustling, adding their warmth and their ambience to your smoky, drafty home. You're layered up in your scratchy woolens, and you're getting by on porridge and salty stew. You've done everything you can to stave off the cold and the hunger. But even with all these strategies, medieval winter wasn't just about enduring physical discomfort. It was also a relentless assault on your health. This season of scarcity and cold was, quite simply, a time of greatly increased sickness and suffering. Imagine trying to fight off a chest cold when you live in a damp, smoky house, are perpetually slightly hungry, and the temperature rarely rises above freezing outside. That persistent cough that starts in the autumn? It's not going away anytime soon. Respiratory illnesses, coughs, colds, bronchitis, pneumonia, were rampant during the winter months. The constant exposure to cold, damp air, combined with the irritating effects of breathing wood smoke day in and day out, created a perfect storm for lung problems. Your lungs felt heavy, your chest ached, and every breath in the freezing air felt like tiny needles. There was no Vicks VapoRub, no cough syrup, no antibiotics. You just coughed, and hoped your body was strong enough to fight it off. The lack of a varied, nutritious diet, especially the severe shortage of fresh fruits and vegetables, left your body weakened and less able to fight off infections. Remember that monotonous diet of grain, salt, and dried legumes? It might keep you from starving, but it didn't provide the essential vitamins and minerals your body needed to stay healthy. You were likely vitamin deficient, your immune system running on empty. A simple cold could easily turn into something much more serious, and something serious could quickly become fatal. Your body was already working overtime just to stay warm and digest meager food. It didn't have much energy left for fighting off invaders. The cold itself caused its own set of problems. Aches and pains were constant companions. Your joints felt stiff and sore from the damp and the cold, especially after a day of hard labor, even if the labor was just fetching water or chopping precious firewood. Your fingers and toes were perpetually numb, vulnerable to chilblains, painful, itchy swellings caused by exposure to cold and damp that could easily become infected. In extreme cases, frostbite was a very real danger, leading to permanent injury or even the loss of limbs. Imagine the agony of thawing out frostbitten fingers or toes with no pain relief. Just pain. Lots of pain. And then there was the issue of hygiene, which, as we've discussed, was already a challenge in medieval times, and not exactly improved by sharing your living space with livestock. Close quarters, poor ventilation, and the difficulty of washing yourself and your clothes meant that diseases could spread through a household and a village with terrifying speed. Illnesses that are minor inconveniences today could be devastating then. Dysentery, typhoid, various fevers, they stalked the medieval village year-round, but the weakened state of the population and the close confinement in winter made outbreaks particularly deadly. It's like a permanent, low-grade flu season mixed with the occasional plague-like experience. You hope like heck your immune system was having a better time of it than your neighbors. Medical care, as you might guess, wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. There were no doctors in the modern sense readily available to peasants. You might rely on a village-wise woman or man who had knowledge of herbal remedies, passed down through generations. These remedies, concocted from local plants, might offer some relief for minor ailments, but they were powerless against serious infections or diseases. For anything significant, you were largely on your own, relying on luck, rest, if you could afford to stop working, and prayer. Bleeding or purging might be attempted in some cases, practices that often did more harm than good. Imagine having a fever and someone suggests draining some of your blood to make you feel better. Yeah, no thanks. Modern medicine seems like pure magic in comparison. Injuries were also more likely in winter. Working in freezing conditions, with numb hands and slippery ground, increased the risk of accidents. A sprained ankle, a deep cut, a broken bone, these were serious threats even in warmer months, but in winter, with limited mobility, difficulty keeping wounds clean in a smoky, animal-filled house, and no access to professional medical care, a simple injury could easily become infected and life-threatening. You couldn't just pop to the emergency room. Your emergency room was, well, nowhere. You just hoped your body could heal itself, or you relied on the limited, often ineffective, knowledge of your neighbors. Historians still argue whether specific epidemic diseases like influenza or tuberculosis were particularly exacerbated by the conditions of medieval winter, or if the increased mortality was primarily due to the cumulative effects of cold, malnutrition, and common infections in a weakened population. The records are often vague, but the outcome was clear: more people died in winter. A mainstream historical fact is that infant and child mortality rates were significantly higher in medieval Europe compared to today, and these rates often peaked during the winter months due to increased vulnerability to cold, respiratory infections, and malnutrition. Getting young children through the winter was a constant, desperate struggle. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval folk remedies for winter ailments involve surprisingly elaborate, and often bizarre, concoctions, sometimes including animal parts, ground stones, or even human bodily fluids, alongside the more sensible herbal remedies. For example, a cure for a cough might involve drinking a brew made from boiled fox lungs or rubbing your chest with goose fat. You can almost hear the ASMR potential. Now gently apply this rendered goose fat to your chest, feel the greasy warmth seep in, ignore the faint smell of poultry. Maybe stick to the herbal tea. The psychological toll of constant sickness and suffering cannot be overstated. Seeing your family members, especially children, weakened by illness with little you could do to help, added immense stress to an already difficult existence. The fear of falling ill yourself, knowing it could incapacitate you and leave your family without labor or a provider, was a constant shadow hanging over the winter months. It wasn't just about physical survival. It was about maintaining hope and resilience in the face of relentless hardship and vulnerability. You were living with the constant knowledge that a bad cough or a fall on the ice could be the beginning of the end. It makes you appreciate not just modern medicine, but simply being warm, dry, and well fed enough for your body to fight off a common cold without it being a major existential threat. So, you're battling the cold, the hunger, the sickness that seems to cling to the smoky air. Your body aches from the damp and chill, and the thought of stepping outside into the biting wind makes you wince. But life doesn't stop entirely just because winter has arrived. The rhythms of the medieval peasant year were dictated by the sun and the seasons, and winter brought a dramatic shift in the kind of work you did, and the pace at which you did it. It wasn't a holiday, not by a long shot, but it was a different kind of struggle, a different kind of labor compared to the frantic race against time that defined the warmer months. Think back to spring and summer. From sunup to sundown, you were in the fields. Plowing, sowing, weeding, tending crops. The days were long, the sun was hot, and the work was backbreakingly intense. Every hour of daylight was precious, a gift from the heavens that had to be exploited to its absolute maximum. Then came the harvest in late summer and autumn, an even more brutal period of unrelenting labor. Cutting grain with sickles, binding sheaves, hauling everything back to the village, threshing, winnowing, storing the precious yield. It was a desperate, exhausting sprint to bring in enough food to last the entire year, including the looming, hungry winter. You worked until you dropped, fueled by the knowledge that failure meant starvation. It was a period of relentless physical exertion, often from before dawn until after dusk, driven by the urgency of the growing and harvesting cycle. Your muscles screamed, your hands were calloused and cracked, and sleep was a luxury you barely indulged in. Now, contrast that with winter. The days are short, barely offering a few hours of weak daylight before plunging back into darkness. The ground is often frozen solid or covered in snow, making plowing or significant fieldwork impossible. The biting cold makes many outdoor tasks incredibly difficult and dangerous. So, the intense, field-based agricultural labor that consumed your life for most of the year largely grinds to a halt. This didn't mean you were idle, far from it, but the nature of the work changed profoundly. This shift often led to a period of reduced physical demands compared to the peak seasons. You weren't out in the fields for 14 hours a day, drenched in sweat or rain. The pace slowed, dictated by the limited daylight and the need to conserve energy in the cold. This is sometimes referred to as the winter rest period, though that term can be misleading. It wasn't a time of leisure in the modern sense. It was a necessary adaptation to the environmental realities. Your body, battered by the harvest, got a chance to recover slightly, though the constant cold, hunger, and sickness often made that recovery difficult. So, what did you do during these long, dark winter days? A lot of the work shifted indoors or closer to the village. Mending and repairing were constant tasks. Tools broken during the harvest needed fixing. Worn-out clothes, those precious layers of wool and linen we talked about, needed patching and darning. Leather shoes needed repair. This was skilled, necessary work that helped preserve valuable resources. Imagine trying to sew with numb fingers by the flickering light of the fire. It required patience and dexterity you probably developed out of sheer necessity. Crafts became more prominent. Women would spend hours spinning wool into yarn using a drop spindle, or weaving that yarn into cloth on a simple loom. Men might do woodworking, repairing furniture, making new tools, or crafting simple items for use or trade. These were tasks that could be done indoors, by the fire, utilizing the materials gathered or produced during the warmer months. It was productive time, turning raw resources into usable goods, preparing for the demands of the next year. It wasn't as physically demanding as swinging a scythe all day, but it still required focus and skill. Plus, it kept your hands busy and your mind occupied during the long hours. Animal care remained essential, and in some ways, became more demanding. Remember how you shared your home with them? You had to ensure they were fed and watered, which meant breaking ice on the well or stream and hauling heavy buckets. The byre or animal section of the house needed cleaning, a cold, smelly, and unpleasant task. Animals were vulnerable to the cold and sickness too, and losing one could be devastating to your family's prospects. So, tending to them, keeping them healthy and alive through the winter, was a critical, daily responsibility. Gathering fuel, primarily firewood, was also a major winter task. While you hopefully laid in a good supply before the snow, you might still need to venture out to collect more, or chop and prepare the wood you had. This was hard, cold work, involving slogging through snow or frozen ground, swinging an axe with numb hands, and hauling heavy logs back to the house. It was a constant, low-level labor demand that ensured the life-giving fire kept burning. Historians still argue whether the winter period represented a true, slack season, with significant leisure time for medieval peasants, or if the reduction in fieldwork was simply replaced by other essential, albeit less physically demanding, tasks like maintenance, crafts, and fuel gathering. The reality likely varied greatly depending on the region, the climate, and the specific resources available to the village and household. The shortened days themselves enforced a different rhythm. With limited artificial light, the day effectively ended when the sun went down. This meant long evenings and nights spent mostly by the fire, perhaps sleeping more than in the summer months, simply because there wasn't enough light to do much else. This enforced rest, combined with the different type of labor, shaped the physical and mental state of the peasant through the winter. It was a time for the body to recoup some strength, even as it battled the cold and hunger. A mainstream historical fact is that the agricultural year heavily dictated the work patterns of medieval peasants, with the vast majority of labor concentrated in the spring, summer, and autumn for cultivation and harvest, leading to a significant shift in activity during the winter months. A quirky tidbit is that winter was often considered the prime season for butchering livestock, particularly pigs. The cold weather helped preserve the meat, making the crucial process of salting and smoking more effective. So, while you might have been eating salted pork all winter, the actual slaughter and initial preservation often happened in the early part of the cold season, a bloody and busy time that broke the monotony of other winter tasks. Imagine the brief, intense burst of activity and the subsequent smell of curing meat. The psychological shift from the constant pressure of the fields to the slower, more confined pace of winter life was also significant. It could be a relief to escape the relentless sun and physical grind, but the confinement, the darkness, the constant worry about food and warmth, and the increased sickness brought their own stresses. It wasn't an easy time, but it was different. You adapted your labor, your routine, your very definition of a busy day, to the harsh realities of the medieval winter. You worked when you could, rested when the darkness or the cold forced you to, and kept the essential tasks going, praying for the return of the sun and the promise of spring labor, even knowing how hard it would be. So, you've adapted your rhythms to the short, cold days of winter, focusing on indoor tasks, repairs, and animal care instead of the back-breaking fieldwork that defines the rest of your year. Your body gets a slight reprieve from the constant strain of the harvest, even as it battles the cold and the gnawing hunger. Winter, with its predictable cycle of scarcity and hardship, is your most reliable annual enemy. You know it's coming, you prepare for it as best you can, and you grit your teeth and endure. But the medieval peasant life wasn't just about surviving the winter. It was about navigating a world where other, less predictable, and often more devastating threats lurked year-round. The cold was a constant adversary, yes, but famine, disease, and war were the four horsemen of the apocalypse waiting just beyond the horizon, any one of which could wipe out your family, your village, or even your entire region, regardless of the season. Let's talk about famine. While winter was the season when food stores ran lowest, the threat of not having enough to eat was a constant shadow. Your entire existence depended on the success of the harvest. One bad year, a drought that withered the crops, excessive rain that rotted them in the fields, a late frost that killed the seedlings, or swarms of pests like locusts or rodents that devoured the grain, could mean widespread starvation. And unlike winter, which you could prepare for by storing food, a sudden crop failure left you with nothing to store. Imagine working yourself to the bone all spring and summer, watching your crops grow, only to have a hailstorm flatten everything a week before harvest, or a blight turn your precious grain black and inedible. That wasn't just a financial setback, it was a death sentence for many. Peasants had virtually no safety net against this. You lived hand to mouth, year to year. There were no government aid programs, no insurance. If the harvest failed, you went hungry. Period. You might try to eat wild plants, bark, or even roots that were normally considered inedible, desperate attempts to fill your stomach with anything. You might sell off precious tools, animals, or even land, if you owned any, which most peasants didn't, for a pittance, just to buy a few handfuls of grain at inflated prices from someone who had managed to hoard some or who wasn't affected by the same disaster. This could push a family into irreversible poverty, making the next year's survival even less likely. Famine wasn't just a period of hunger, it was a cascade of disaster that could dismantle lives and communities. Then there was disease. We touched on how winter exacerbated illnesses due to cold, damp, and poor nutrition, but sickness was a year-round threat in the medieval world. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, even outside of sharing your home with animals. Clean water was hard to come by and often contaminated. Waste disposal was haphazard. Personal hygiene, while perhaps more frequent in warmer weather when water wasn't frozen, was still limited by modern standards. Remember trying to keep cleanish? Now imagine doing that in a time when even basic understanding of germs was centuries away. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and various fevers were endemic, meaning they were always present in the population, flaring up regularly. A simple cut could easily become infected and kill you. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and baby. Life expectancy was short, and a significant portion of children didn't survive to adulthood. But beyond the constant background threat of common illnesses, there were the terrifying, unpredictable epidemics. The most infamous, of course, was the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. But there were other, less famous but still devastating outbreaks of plague, smallpox, influenza, and other contagious diseases throughout the medieval period. When one of these arrived in your village, there was nowhere to run, nothing to do. You simply waited, prayed, and watched your neighbors, your family, fall ill and die, often within days. There was no medical knowledge to understand what was happening, let alone stop it. Your only hope was that you might somehow be spared by chance or divine intervention. Imagine the sheer terror of living with the knowledge that an invisible killer could arrive at any moment and decimate everyone you knew. It makes the constant struggle against winter seem almost manageable by comparison. At least the cold was visible. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically had enough protein and fat in their diets year-round, not just in winter, which would have impacted their overall health and resilience to disease. The reliance on grain meant they might have been calorie sufficient after a good harvest, but potentially lacked other vital nutrients needed for a strong immune system. And finally, there was war. While you might picture knights in shining armor charging across open fields, the reality of medieval conflict for peasants was often far more brutal and direct. Armies, whether they belonged to kings, powerful lords, or even mercenary bands, needed to eat. And they ate by living off the land they marched through. This meant taking your livestock, requisitioning your grain stores, the very ones you were hoping would get you through winter, trampling your fields, and sometimes simply looting and burning your village to deny resources to the enemy or just for sheer brutality. Imagine having survived a harsh winter, worked all spring planting your crops, only for an army to march through in the summer, destroying everything you've worked for in a single day. It was devastating. Peasants were often caught in the middle of conflicts that had nothing to do with them. Local lords squabbling over territory could mean your village became a battleground or was subjected to punitive raids. You might be forced to provide labor, supplies, or even fighting men, though peasants were generally considered poor-quality soldiers, for your lord's campaigns. Your life and livelihood were incredibly vulnerable to the whims and conflicts of the powerful elite above you. There was no Geneva Convention protecting civilians. If an army came calling, you either hid, fled, or faced the consequences. A quirky tidbit is that during times of conflict, peasants in some areas would dismantle their plows and hide the iron parts, as iron was valuable and easily stolen by passing soldiers, and losing your plowshare meant you couldn't prepare your fields for the next year, adding famine to the woes of war. It was a desperate measure to protect the absolute essentials of your survival. These three threats, famine, disease, and war, were not isolated incidents. They often came in combination, creating a vicious cycle. War could disrupt farming, leading to famine. Famine weakened the population, making them more susceptible to disease. Disease outbreaks, particularly during harvest season, could lead to crop failures, causing famine. It was a fragile existence, constantly teetering on the brink of disaster. You lived with a pervasive sense of insecurity, knowing that even if you did everything right, worked hard, stored food, stayed warm, forces entirely outside your control could arrive at any moment and take everything away. It makes you appreciate things like stable governments, public health systems, and grocery stores that are stocked year-round. For a medieval peasant, simply surviving from one year to the next, let alone thriving, was an incredible act of resilience against a multitude of relentless threats. Living with constant threats like famine, disease, and the potential for war makes you acutely aware of your body's fragility. And one factor that played a huge role in the spread of sickness, especially when you're cooped up in a smoky hut all winter, was hygiene. Or the distinct lack thereof, by modern standards. Let's be clear, medieval people weren't trying to be dirty. They just faced immense obstacles to keeping clean that we can barely imagine. Your version of hygiene was a constant, often losing, battle against dirt, grime, sweat, animal dander, remember your barnyard roommates, and the sheer difficulty of getting clean in a world without running water or soap from a bottle. Think about the basics. Washing your hands, face, or feet was probably a daily occurrence for most, if possible. You'd use water from the village well or a nearby stream. But in winter? That water is bone-achingly cold, maybe even requiring you to break through a layer of ice just to get it. Dipping your hands into freezing water in a freezing house isn't exactly a pleasant start or end to your day. You did it out of necessity, a quick splash to remove the most obvious grime, not a leisurely cleanse. Your skin was probably perpetually chapped and sore from the cold and the harshness of the water. And drying? You likely just rubbed them on your perpetually damp clothes or let the air do it, which in winter meant they stayed cold and damp for a long time. Full-body bathing was a much rarer event, especially in winter. It required heating a large amount of water, which consumed precious firewood, the very fuel you needed to stay alive and cook your meager meals. Setting up a tub, if you even owned one, more likely it was a shared village resource or a large barrel, was a major undertaking. So, baths were infrequent, perhaps only a few times a year, maybe coinciding with major festivals or before significant life events like marriage. When you did bathe, it might even be a communal affair, sharing the heated water with your family or even neighbors to conserve fuel. Imagine a medieval bath night, everyone taking turns in the same smoky water, trying to get clean while conserving heat and water. It makes you appreciate the simple luxury of a private, hot shower whenever you want one. Your version of bath bombs was probably just hoping the water wasn't too muddy. Washing clothes in winter was another monumental task. Those precious woolens, your main defense against the cold, were heavy, absorbed moisture readily, and took forever to dry. And again you needed water, which was cold and hard to get. Soap, as we know it, was a luxury. Peasants might use lye, made from wood ash and animal fat, or simply rub clothes with ash or a harsh plant-based cleaner, then beat them against stones in the stream or with wooden paddles. This process was incredibly labor-intensive and, in freezing temperatures, utterly miserable. Drying the clothes was the biggest challenge. Hanging damp woolens in a cold, smoky, poorly ventilated house meant they would take days, maybe even weeks, to dry fully, often acquiring a permanent smell of smoke and dampness. Wearing slightly damp woolens was a recipe for being constantly cold and increasing your risk of sickness. So, your clothes likely went for long periods without a proper wash, accumulating layers of dirt, sweat, and the inevitable animal dander from your cohabitants. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically bathed more or less frequently than their wealthier counterparts, and whether their hygiene practices were primarily driven by practicality, removing visible dirt, avoiding smells, or also influenced by religious or social customs. While the wealthy certainly had more resources for cleanliness, bathing habits varied greatly across regions and time periods. Beyond the visible dirt, there was the constant battle against pests. Fleas and lice were ubiquitous. They lived in your clothes, your bedding, if you had any beyond straw and rags, and even in the thatched roof of your house. The warmth of your body and your shared animal heat was a perfect environment for them to thrive. You'd spend time picking lice from your hair or clothes, a constant, itchy annoyance. There were no effective insecticides. You just lived with them, scratching and trying to ignore the constant crawling sensation. Sharing your home with livestock only added to the problem, providing more hosts and breeding grounds for parasites. It's enough to make your skin crawl just thinking about it. Indoor waste disposal was also a challenge. Chamber pots would be used during the night, and their contents emptied outside, perhaps into a midden heap, a communal pile of waste, near the house or village. This might seem basic, but it was a step up from just going wherever you pleased. However, these midden heaps were breeding grounds for flies and rodents in warmer months, and could still pose health risks in winter. The proximity of human and animal waste to living spaces and water sources was a major factor in the spread of diseases like dysentery. Remember that ever-present risk of illness? Hygiene, or the lack thereof, played a huge role. A quirky tidbit about medieval hygiene is that urine was sometimes used as a cleaning agent, particularly for washing clothes. The ammonia in stale urine could act as a detergent and bleach. So, your laundry day might have involved a trip to the midden heap or a collection pot before heading to the freezing stream. It sounds pungent, but it was a readily available resource with some cleaning properties. Definitely not the fresh linen scent advertised on modern laundry detergent bottles. Despite these challenges, medieval peasants did make efforts to keep clean using the resources available to them. They understood that removing dirt and washing helped to some extent, even if they didn't grasp the concept of microscopic germs. Their practices were dictated by necessity, cost, and the sheer physical effort required. A small amount of soap might be made from animal fat and ash, used sparingly for washing hands or specific items. Rubbing down with rough cloths or straw might serve as a form of dry cleaning or exfoliation. You did what you could, with what you had, in the conditions you lived in. The constant struggle for cleanliness added another layer to the hardship of winter. The cold made washing difficult and drying impossible. The confinement in smoky, shared spaces, especially with animals, increased dirt and pests. The lack of fresh food weakened your body's ability to fight off the illnesses that thrived in these conditions. Your body was a constant battleground, fighting the cold from the outside, the smoke from the inside, the hunger from your gut, the pests on your skin, and the diseases lurking in the damp, unsanitary environment. Good hygiene was a distant dream, a luxury almost unimaginable. You just aimed for cleanish, and even that was a victory against the overwhelming odds. You were essentially living in a permanent state of needing a really good scrub and a long soak in hot water, either of which were readily available. It makes stepping out of a modern shower feel like a miraculous escape from a life of perpetual grime. So, you're living in a permanent state of needing a really good scrub and a long soak in hot water, either of which are readily available. It makes stepping out of a modern shower feel like a miraculous escape from a life of perpetual grime. But even in that state of perpetual grime and discomfort, when the sun went down and the outdoor work stopped, life wasn't just about shivering, scratching, and worrying about whether your salted pork was going to give you scurvy and indigestion simultaneously. The long nights, while challenging and dark, also offered a different kind of time, a shift in focus from the relentless physical demands of the fields to the more confined, but sometimes more connected, world inside your smoky hut. This was the time for indoor life, for finding small moments of warmth, connection, and even a semblance of leisure amidst the hardship. Remember how we talked about the seasonal rhythms? The intense, back-breaking labor of spring, summer, and autumn largely ceased when the ground froze and the snow fell. This didn't mean you were suddenly on vacation, far from it, but it did mean your days weren't consumed by dawn-to-dusk fieldwork. The limited daylight hours were spent on essential tasks like animal care, fuel gathering, and basic maintenance. But then the sun would set, plunging the world into darkness, and the long, long hours until dawn stretched ahead. With limited light sources, that sputtering rushlight or maybe a tallow candle if you were lucky, mostly just the glow of the fire, there wasn't much you could do that required fine detail, or moving around much. This enforced confinement and a shift in work patterns meant that evenings and nights became the primary time for indoor activities. The most important of these activities, and perhaps the most vital for maintaining spirits and transmitting knowledge, was storytelling. With no books, you couldn't read anyway, and they were incredibly rare and expensive. No radio, no television, no internet, gasp! The spoken word was the primary form of entertainment and education. Families would gather around the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the smoky walls, and share tales. These weren't just simple bedtime stories. They were histories, myths, legends, cautionary tales, jokes, riddles, and news such as it was. Stories of saints, of local heroes, or villains, of magical creatures lurking in the woods, of faraway lands you would never see, of the hardships of your ancestors, and of the triumphs of your community. This oral tradition was incredibly rich and varied. It was how history was remembered, how cultural values were passed down, and how people made sense of the world around them. The best storytellers were valued members of the community, able to captivate listeners and make the long, dark nights feel a little less oppressive. Imagine the collective sigh of relief when a particularly good storyteller began a familiar, comforting tale, or the hushed silence when they launched into something new and exciting, or terrifying. It was a communal experience, binding the family, and sometimes neighbors together in the shared space of the story. It's the original binge-watching, but instead of a glowing screen, you had a flickering fire and the power of human imagination. Plus, no buffering, though you might get interrupted by a pig snoring loudly. Beyond storytelling, there were simple games that could be played by firelight. Board games like Nine Men's Morris, which could be scratched into a piece of wood or even the packed earth floor, played with stones or bone pieces. Dice games were popular, though sometimes associated with gambling, which might be frowned upon. Riddle games were a way to test wit and knowledge, passing the time with friendly competition. Finger games, counting games, or simple guessing games that didn't require any equipment could also while away the hours. These games weren't complex, but they provided interaction, a distraction from the cold and hunger, and a way to engage the minds of children and adults alike. It makes you realize how creative people can be with limited resources. All you really need is a few rocks and a dirt patch for a good time. And then there were the crafts. As we discussed, winter was the time for mending and making. This wasn't always just solitary labor, it could also be a social activity. Women might gather together in one hut to spin wool, the rhythmic whirring of the drop spindles or spinning wheels creating a background hum for conversation, shared stories, and gossip. Men might work on woodworking projects together, helping each other shape tools or repair wagons. These weren't formal workshops. They were simply pragmatic gatherings where necessary work got done more efficiently, more enjoyably, and warmer than doing it alone in a cold corner. The line between work and leisure was much blurrier than today. Many activities served both purposes. You were being productive, yes, but you were also together, sharing time and conversation. It's like a medieval crafting circle, but instead of making cute little felt animals, you're making thread for your next itchy tunic. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically had enough true leisure time, meaning time free from necessary labor or chores, or if the winter, rest, period was simply filled with different forms of essential work like maintenance and craft production. The answer likely depended on the specific household, their resources, and the demands placed upon them by their lord. These indoor activities, whether it was listening to a story, playing a game, or working on a craft project, were vital for mental well-being. The constant physical hardship, the gnawing hunger, the cold, the fear of sickness and famine, these took a heavy psychological toll. Having something to occupy your mind, something to look forward to in the long evenings, something that connected you to others, was incredibly important. It provided a sense of normalcy, a sense of community, and a much-needed distraction from the grim realities of survival. It was a way to maintain hope, to remember that life wasn't just suffering, that there were moments of connection, laughter, and shared humanity, even in the darkest, coldest times. A mainstream historical fact is that oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting history, culture, and entertainment among medieval peasants, with storytelling being a central activity during the long winter evenings. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval games, like variations of Nine Men's Morris, were played on boards carved into permanent fixtures, like church benches or stone steps, suggesting that even in more public spaces, people sought out opportunities for simple leisure and games when work wasn't pressing. So, next time you see old carvings on a church bench, maybe it wasn't just decorative. It was a medieval game board waiting for players. Your ancestors were apparently just as prone to doodling on furniture as you are. The sounds of a medieval peasant home on a winter evening would have been a mix of the practical and the social, the crackling and hissing of the fire, the rhythmic scrape of a spindle or the clatter of a loom, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from a game, the voice of a storyteller, the rustling of animals in the corner, and the ever-present background noise of the wind whistling through cracks and the distant howl of a wolf. It wasn't quiet, but it was alive, a testament to the human spirit's ability to find ways to connect, to create, and to endure, even when simply staying warm and fed was a monumental struggle. These moments by the fire, sharing stories and simple activities, were the warm heart of the cold, dark medieval winter, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life found a way to be lived, not just survived. So, you're living in a permanent state of needing a really good scrub and a long soak in hot water, either of which are readily available. It makes stepping out of a modern shower feel like a miraculous escape from a life of perpetual grime. But even in that state of perpetual grime and discomfort, when the sun went down and the outdoor work stopped, life wasn't just about shivering, scratching, and worrying about whether your salted pork was going to give you scurvy and indigestion simultaneously. The long nights, while challenging and dark, also offered a different kind of time, a shift in focus from the relentless physical demands of the fields to the more confined, but sometimes more connected, world inside your smoky hut. This was the time for indoor life, for finding small moments of warmth, connection, and even a semblance of leisure amidst the hardship. Remember how we talked about the seasonal rhythms? The intense, back-breaking labor of spring, summer, and autumn largely ceased when the ground froze and the snow fell. This didn't mean you were suddenly on vacation, far from it, but it did mean your days weren't consumed by dawn-to-dusk fieldwork. The limited daylight hours were spent on essential tasks like animal care, fuel gathering, and basic maintenance. But then the sun would set, plunging the world into darkness, and the long hours until dawn stretched ahead. With limited light sources, that sputtering rushlight or maybe a tallow candle if you were lucky, mostly just the glow of the fire, there wasn't much you could do that required fine detail, or moving around much. This enforced confinement and the shift in work patterns meant that evenings and nights became the primary time for indoor activities. The most important of these activities, and perhaps the most vital for maintaining spirits and transmitting knowledge, was storytelling. With no books, you couldn't read anyway, and they were incredibly rare and expensive. No radio, no television, no internet. Gasp! The spoken word was the primary form of entertainment and education. Families would gather around the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the smoky walls, and share tales. These weren't just simple bedtime stories. They were histories, myths, legends, cautionary tales, jokes, riddles, and news such as it was. Stories of saints, of local heroes, or villains, of magical creatures lurking in the woods, of faraway lands you would never see, of the hardships of your ancestors, and of the triumphs of your community. This oral tradition was incredibly rich and varied. It was how history was remembered, how cultural values were passed down, and how people made sense of the world around them. The best storytellers were valued members of the community, able to captivate listeners and make the long, dark nights feel a little less oppressive. Imagine the collective sigh of relief when a particularly good storyteller began a familiar, comforting tale, or the hushed silence when they launched into something new and exciting, or terrifying. It was a communal experience, binding the family, and sometimes neighbors together in the shared space of the story. It's the original binge-watching, but instead of a glowing screen, you had a flickering fire and the power of human imagination. Plus, no buffering, though you might get interrupted by a pig snoring loudly. Beyond storytelling, there were simple games that could be played by firelight. Board games like Nine Men's Morris, which could be scratched into a piece of wood or even the packed earth floor, played with stones or bone pieces. Dice games were popular, though sometimes associated with gambling, which might be frowned upon. Riddle games were a way to test wit and knowledge, passing the time with friendly competition. Finger games, counting games, or simple guessing games that didn't require any equipment could also while away the hours. These games weren't complex, but they provided interaction, a distraction from the cold and hunger, and a way to engage the minds of children and adults alike. It makes you realize how creative people can be with limited resources. All you really need is a few rocks and a dirt patch for a good time. And then there were the crafts. As we discussed, winter was the time for mending and making. This wasn't always just solitary labor, it could also be a social activity. Women might gather together in one hut to spin wool, the rhythmic whirring of the drop spindles or spinning wheels creating a background hum for conversation, shared stories, and gossip. Men might work on woodworking projects together, helping each other shape tools or repair wagons. These weren't formal workshops. They were simply pragmatic gatherings where necessary work got done more efficiently, more enjoyably, and warmer than doing it alone in a cold corner. The line between work and leisure was much blurrier than today. Many activities served both purposes. You were being productive, yes, but you were also together, sharing time and conversation. It's like a medieval crafting circle, but instead of making cute little felt animals, you're making thread for your next itchy tunic. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically had enough true leisure time, meaning time free from necessary labor or chores, or if the winter, rest, period was simply filled with different forms of essential work like maintenance and craft production. The answer likely depended on the specific household, their resources, and the demands placed upon them by their lord. These indoor activities, whether it was listening to a story, playing a game, or working on a craft project, were vital for mental well-being. The constant physical hardship, the gnawing hunger, the cold, the fear of sickness and famine, these took a heavy psychological toll. Having something to occupy your mind, something to look forward to in the long evenings, something that connected you to others, was incredibly important. It provided a sense of normalcy, a sense of community, and a much-needed distraction from the grim realities of survival. It was a way to maintain hope, to remember that life wasn't just suffering, that there were moments of connection, laughter, and shared humanity, even in the darkest, coldest times. A mainstream historical fact is that oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting history, culture, and entertainment among medieval peasants, with storytelling being a central activity during the long winter evenings. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval games, like variations of Nine Men's Morris, were played on boards carved into permanent fixtures, like church benches or stone steps, suggesting that even in more public spaces, people sought out opportunities for simple leisure and games when work wasn't pressing. So, next time you see old carvings on a church bench, maybe it wasn't just decorative. It was a medieval game board waiting for players. Your ancestors were apparently just as prone to doodling on furniture as you are. The sounds of a medieval peasant home on a winter evening would have been a mix of the practical and the social, the crackling and hissing of the fire, the rhythmic scrape of a spindle or the clatter of a loom, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from a game, the voice of a storyteller, the rustling of animals in the corner, and the ever-present background noise of the wind whistling through cracks and the distant howl of a wolf. It wasn't quiet, but it was alive, a testament to the human spirit's ability to find ways to connect, to create, and to endure, even when simply staying warm and fed was a monumental struggle. These moments by the fire, sharing stories and simple activities, were the warm heart of the cold, dark medieval winter, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life found a way to be lived, not just survived. But even with those moments of connection and distraction by the fire, the constant, relentless pressure of scarcity was never far from your mind. Let's talk about the gnawing hunger that wasn't just a winter phenomenon, but a constant, low-grade thrum throughout much of the year, intensifying into a terrifying roar during the lean months. You've stored your grain, your salted meat, your dried legumes, but the fundamental reality of medieval peasant life was living on the edge of subsistence. Having enough food wasn't a given, it was something you fought for every single day, and the fear of not having enough was a constant companion, a cold knot in your stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Your diet, as we discussed, was heavily reliant on grain, porridge, bread, maybe some peas and beans. This provided calories, yes, but often not enough, especially during periods of intense labor or when stores ran low. The portions were meager, carefully measured out to make them stretch as far as possible. You ate to live, not to enjoy. Every meal was a calculation. Is this enough to give me the strength to work tomorrow? How many more days can this sack of grain last? The feeling of hunger was probably something you got used to, a dull ache that was just part of the background noise of your existence, like the wind whistling through the walls. Coping with this constant scarcity required a multitude of strategies, born out of generations of hard-won knowledge and desperate necessity. Gleaning, for instance, was a crucial practice after the harvest. Once the Lord and his reapers had taken their share and cleared the fields, peasant women and children would go through the stubble, picking up any individual stalks of grain that had been dropped or missed. It was backbreaking work, collecting single ears of wheat or barley, but every handful added up. These gleanings, scraps from the table of the harvest, could mean the difference between a few more days of food or going hungry. It was a right often fiercely defended by peasants, sometimes even codified in local custom, a testament to how vital even the smallest amount of extra food was. Foraging was another way to supplement the meager diet, especially in times of scarcity. In spring and summer, this might mean gathering wild berries, nuts, or greens from the woods or hedgerows. But in winter the options were far more limited. Perhaps you knew where to find hardy roots that could be dug up, or you might search for edible bark or fungi, though the latter was risky if you didn't know exactly what you were doing. These were desperate measures, often providing minimal nutritional value, but they could offer a tiny bit of bulk to fill an empty stomach. Imagine scraping bark off a tree, knowing that this might be part of your meal tonight. It puts a new spin on eating your greens. Hunting and fishing could provide protein, but these were often strictly controlled by the Lord. Peasants typically didn't have the right to hunt large game in the Lord's forests. Poaching was a capital crime, punishable by severe penalties, sometimes even death, if you were caught taking the Lord's deer or boar. Smaller game, like rabbits or birds, might be fair game depending on local custom, but trapping or snaring required skill and luck, and these animals were also struggling to survive the winter. Fishing rights on rivers or lakes were also often owned by the Lord or the church, limiting access for peasants. So, while the woods and rivers held potential food, accessing it was dangerous and often forbidden. Every part of an animal was used when one was butchered. There was no waste. Bones were boiled for broth, organs were eaten, blood might be used in cooking. This wasn't just about being thrifty, it was about maximizing every single calorie and nutrient available. The concept of choice cuts was entirely alien. You ate whatever part of the animal you could get your hands on. Historians still argue whether medieval peasant agriculture produced a consistent surplus that allowed for accumulation and resilience against bad years, or if most peasants lived perpetually on the brink of subsistence, with little buffer against crop failure or other disasters. The reality likely varied significantly based on the fertility of the land, the demands of the Lord, and the presence of markets or trade networks. Selling or bartering was another strategy, though difficult in winter when travel was hard and others were also struggling. If you had a small surplus of something, perhaps a few extra eggs before winter truly bit down, or some homespun cloth you'd made, you might try to trade it for grain or other necessities. But this assumed someone else had a surplus of what you needed, which was less likely in winter. More often, you were trying to sell off assets, a tool, a piece of furniture, perhaps even an animal if you had more than one, just to buy food, a downward spiral into deeper poverty. A quirky tidbit is that in times of severe famine, medieval peasants might resort to eating famine foods like acorns, tree bark, or even clay mixed with straw to provide some bulk and stave off the worst hunger pangs. These were often indigestible and could cause illness, but they were eaten out of sheer desperation when nothing else was available. Imagine eating dirt to feel full. That's a level of hunger most of us cannot comprehend. The constant stress of scarcity had profound effects beyond just physical hunger. It shaped social interactions, fostering mutual aid in some cases, but also leading to suspicion, resentment, and conflict in others. It influenced family dynamics, as everyone had to contribute to the struggle for food. It impacted health, making people more vulnerable to disease. And it created a deep, ingrained anxiety about the future, a fear that the food would run out before spring arrived, a fear that was tragically realized for many families every year. You lived with the knowledge that despite all your hard work, despite all your careful planning and preservation, sheer bad luck, a late frost, a plague among your chickens, a lord demanding too much of your harvest, could leave you and your family starving. It makes you appreciate the simple act of opening a cupboard and knowing there will be food there tomorrow. For a medieval peasant, that certainty was an unimaginable luxury. So, you're living in a permanent state of needing a really good scrub and a long soak in hot water, either of which are readily available. It makes stepping out of a modern shower feel like a miraculous escape from a life of perpetual grime. But even in that state of perpetual grime and discomfort, when the sun went down and the outdoor work stopped, life wasn't just about shivering, scratching, and worrying about whether your salted pork was going to give you scurvy and indigestion simultaneously. The long nights, while challenging and dark, also offered a different kind of time, a shift in focus from the relentless physical demands of the fields to the more confined, but sometimes more connected, world inside your smoky hut. This was the time for indoor life, for finding small moments of warmth, connection, and even a semblance of leisure amidst the hardship. Remember how we talked about the seasonal rhythms? The intense, back-breaking labor of spring, summer, and autumn largely ceased when the ground froze and the snow fell. This didn't mean you were suddenly on vacation, far from it, but it did mean your days weren't consumed by dawn-to-dusk fieldwork. The limited daylight hours were spent on essential tasks like animal care, fuel gathering, and basic maintenance. But then the sun would set, plunging the world into darkness, and the long hours until dawn stretched ahead. With limited light sources, that sputtering rushlight or maybe a tallow candle if you were lucky, mostly just the glow of the fire, there wasn't much you could do that required fine detail, or moving around much. This enforced confinement and the shift in work patterns meant that evenings and nights became the primary time for indoor activities. The most important of these activities, and perhaps the most vital for maintaining spirits and transmitting knowledge, was storytelling. With no books, you couldn't read anyway, and they were incredibly rare and expensive. No radio, no television, no internet, gasp! The spoken word was the primary form of entertainment and education. Families would gather around the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the smoky walls, and share tales. These weren't just simple bedtime stories. They were histories, myths, legends, cautionary tales, jokes, riddles, and news such as it was. Stories of saints, of local heroes, or villains, of magical creatures lurking in the woods, of faraway lands you would never see, of the hardships of your ancestors, and of the triumphs of your community. This oral tradition was incredibly rich and varied. It was how history was remembered, how cultural values were passed down, and how people made sense of the world around them. The best storytellers were valued members of the community, able to captivate listeners and make the long, dark nights feel a little less oppressive. Imagine the collective sigh of relief when a particularly good storyteller began a familiar, comforting tale, or the hushed silence when they launched into something new and exciting, or terrifying. It was a communal experience, binding the family, and sometimes neighbors together in the shared space of the story. It's the original binge-watching, but instead of a glowing screen, you had a flickering fire and the power of human imagination. Plus, no buffering, though you might get interrupted by a pig snoring loudly. Beyond storytelling, there were simple games that could be played by firelight. Board games like Nine Men's Morris, which could be scratched into a piece of wood or even the packed earth floor, played with stones or bone pieces. Dice games were popular, though sometimes associated with gambling, which might be frowned upon. Riddle games were a way to test wit and knowledge, passing the time with friendly competition. Finger games, counting games, or simple guessing games that didn't require any equipment could also while away the hours. These games weren't complex, but they provided interaction, a distraction from the cold and hunger, and a way to engage the minds of children and adults alike. It makes you realize how creative people can be with limited resources. All you really need is a few rocks and a dirt patch for a good time. And then there were the crafts. As we discussed, winter was the time for mending and making. This wasn't always just solitary labor, it could also be a social activity. Women might gather together in one hut to spin wool, the rhythmic whirring of the drop spindles or spinning wheels creating a background hum for conversation, shared stories, and gossip. Men might work on woodworking projects together, helping each other shape tools or repair wagons. These weren't formal workshops. They were simply pragmatic gatherings where necessary work got done more efficiently, more enjoyably, and warmer than doing it alone in a cold corner. The line between work and leisure was much blurrier than today. Many activities served both purposes. You were being productive, yes, but you were also together, sharing time and conversation. It's like a medieval crafting circle, but instead of making cute little felt animals, you're making thread for your next itchy tunic. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants typically had enough true leisure time, meaning time free from necessary labor or chores, or if the winter, rest, period was simply filled with different forms of essential work like maintenance and craft production. The answer likely depended on the specific household, their resources, and the demands placed upon them by their lord. These indoor activities, whether it was listening to a story, playing a game, or working on a craft project, were vital for mental well-being. The constant physical hardship, the gnawing hunger, the cold, the fear of sickness and famine, these took a heavy psychological toll. Having something to occupy your mind, something to look forward to in the long evenings, something that connected you to others, was incredibly important. It provided a sense of normalcy, a sense of community, and a much-needed distraction from the grim realities of survival. It was a way to maintain hope, to remember that life wasn't just suffering, that there were moments of connection, laughter, and shared humanity, even in the darkest, coldest times. A mainstream historical fact is that oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting history, culture, and entertainment among medieval peasants, with storytelling being a central activity during the long winter evenings. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval games, like variations of Nine Men's Morris, were played on boards carved into permanent fixtures, like church benches or stone steps, suggesting that even in more public spaces, people sought out opportunities for simple leisure and games when work wasn't pressing. So, next time you see old carvings on a church bench, maybe it wasn't just decorative. It was a medieval game board waiting for players. Your ancestors were apparently just as prone to doodling on furniture as you are. The sounds of a medieval peasant home on a winter evening would have been a mix of the practical and the social, the crackling and hissing of the fire, the rhythmic scrape of a spindle or the clatter of a loom, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from a game, the voice of a storyteller, the rustling of animals in the corner, and the ever-present background noise of the wind whistling through cracks and the distant howl of a wolf. It wasn't quiet, but it was alive, a testament to the human spirit's ability to find ways to connect, to create, and to endure, even when simply staying warm and fed was a monumental struggle. These moments by the fire, sharing stories and simple activities, were the warm heart of the cold, dark medieval winter, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life found a way to be lived, not just survived. But even with those moments of connection and distraction by the fire, the constant, relentless pressure of scarcity was never far from your mind. Let's talk about the gnawing hunger that wasn't just a winter phenomenon, but a constant, low-grade thrum throughout much of the year, intensifying into a terrifying roar during the lean months. You've stored your grain, your salted meat, your dried legumes, but the fundamental reality of medieval peasant life was living on the edge of subsistence. Having enough food wasn't a given, it was something you fought for every single day, and the fear of not having enough was a constant companion, a cold knot in your stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Your diet, as we discussed, was heavily reliant on grain, porridge, bread, maybe some peas and beans. This provided calories, yes, but often not enough, especially during periods of intense labor or when stores ran low. The portions were meager, carefully measured out to make them stretch as far as possible. You ate to live, not to enjoy. Every meal was a calculation. Is this enough to give me the strength to work tomorrow? How many more days can this sack of grain last? The feeling of hunger was probably something you got used to, a dull ache that was just part of the background noise of your existence, like the wind whistling through the walls. Coping with this constant scarcity required a multitude of strategies, born out of generations of hard-won knowledge and desperate necessity. Gleaning, for instance, was a crucial practice after the harvest. Once the Lord and his reapers had taken their share and cleared the fields, peasant women and children would go through the stubble, picking up any individual stalks of grain that had been dropped or missed. It was backbreaking work, collecting single ears of wheat or barley, but every handful added up. These gleanings, scraps from the table of the harvest, could mean the difference between a few more days of food or going hungry. It was a right often fiercely defended by peasants, sometimes even codified in local custom, a testament to how vital even the smallest amount of extra food was. Foraging was another way to supplement the meager diet, especially in times of scarcity. In spring and summer, this might mean gathering wild berries, nuts, or greens from the woods or hedgerows. But in winter the options were far more limited. Perhaps you knew where to find hardy roots that could be dug up, or you might search for edible bark or fungi, though the latter was risky if you didn't know exactly what you were doing. These were desperate measures, often providing minimal nutritional value, but they could offer a tiny bit of bulk to fill an empty stomach. Imagine scraping bark off a tree, knowing that this might be part of your meal tonight. It puts a new spin on eating your greens. Hunting and fishing could provide protein, but these were often strictly controlled by the Lord. Peasants typically didn't have the right to hunt large game in the Lord's forests. Poaching was a capital crime, punishable by severe penalties, sometimes even death, if you were caught taking the Lord's deer or boar. Smaller game, like rabbits or birds, might be fair game depending on local custom, but trapping or snaring required skill and luck, and these animals were also struggling to survive the winter. Fishing rights on rivers or lakes were also often owned by the Lord or the church, limiting access for peasants. So, while the woods and rivers held potential food, accessing it was dangerous and often forbidden. Every part of an animal was used when one was butchered. There was no waste. Bones were boiled for broth, organs were eaten, blood might be used in cooking. This wasn't just about being thrifty, it was about maximizing every single calorie and nutrient available. The concept of choice cuts was entirely alien. You ate whatever part of the animal you could get your hands on. Historians still argue whether medieval peasant agriculture produced a consistent surplus that allowed for accumulation and resilience against bad years, or if most peasants lived perpetually on the brink of subsistence, with little buffer against crop failure or other disasters. The reality likely varied significantly based on the fertility of the land, the demands of the Lord, and the presence of markets or trade networks. Selling or bartering was another strategy, though difficult in winter when travel was hard and others were also struggling. If you had a small surplus of something, perhaps a few extra eggs before winter truly bit down, or some homespun cloth you'd made, you might try to trade it for grain or other necessities. But this assumed someone else had a surplus of what you needed, which was less likely in winter. More often, you were trying to sell off assets, a tool, a piece of furniture, perhaps even an animal if you had more than one, just to buy food, a downward spiral into deeper poverty. A quirky tidbit is that in times of severe famine, medieval peasants might resort to eating famine foods like acorns, tree bark, or even clay mixed with straw to provide some bulk and stave off the worst hunger pangs. These were often indigestible and could cause illness, but they were eaten out of sheer desperation when nothing else was available. Imagine eating dirt to feel full. That's a level of hunger most of us cannot comprehend. The constant stress of scarcity had profound effects beyond just physical hunger. It shaped social interactions, fostering mutual aid in some cases, but also leading to suspicion, resentment, and conflict in others. It influenced family dynamics, as everyone had to contribute to the struggle for food. It impacted health, making people more vulnerable to disease. And it created a deep, ingrained anxiety about the future, a fear that the food would run out before spring arrived, a fear that was tragically realized for many families every year. You lived with the knowledge that despite all your hard work, despite all your careful planning and preservation, sheer bad luck, a late frost, a plague among your chickens, a lord demanding too much of your harvest, could leave you and your family starving. It makes you appreciate the simple act of opening a cupboard and knowing there will be food there tomorrow. For a medieval peasant, that certainty was an unimaginable luxury. Reflecting on the life of a medieval peasant, especially through the lens of winter survival, is really about contemplating the sheer, unyielding resilience of the human spirit. You faced down cold that could kill you, hunger that gnawed at your insides, sickness that preyed on your weakened body, and the constant threat of disaster from failed harvests, disease, or war. You lived in a home that offered minimal protection, dressed in clothes that were scratchy and damp, and ate food that was monotonous and barely sufficient. And yet, somehow your ancestors, the vast majority of whom were peasants, made it through. They endured. What was it that allowed them to persevere against such overwhelming odds? It wasn't just physical toughness, though they had that in abundance. It was a combination of deep knowledge passed down through generations, how to read the weather, how to preserve food, which plants were edible, how to mend and make do. It was an incredible capacity for adaptation, finding ways to use every available resource, from animal body heat to stale urine for cleaning. It was the strength of community bonds, the understanding that you were all in the same struggle and that helping your neighbor was ultimately helping yourself. Remember how we talked about the village helping clear snow or share resources? That wasn't just kindness, it was essential infrastructure for survival. And perhaps most importantly, it was a profound mental fortitude. The ability to find moments of light and connection in the darkness, sharing stories by the fire, playing simple games, working together on crafts. These weren't just ways to pass the time, they were acts of defiance against despair, ways to nurture hope and maintain a sense of shared humanity when everything else was trying to grind you down. Imagine the mental strength it took to face another freezing morning, knowing you'd be hungry and cold, but still getting up and doing what needed to be done for your family and your community. That's resilience on a scale we can barely comprehend in our world of relative comfort and convenience. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the immense hardships and high mortality rates, particularly infant and child mortality, the peasant population of Europe generally grew throughout much of the High Medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1300 AD, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for survival and reproduction even in the face of these challenges, though this growth was periodically checked by major famines and plagues. Historians still argue whether the pervasive hardship of medieval peasant life fostered a collective, stoic mindset that simply accepted suffering as the norm, or if individuals experienced the same range of emotions, hope, despair, joy, fear, as people do today, but simply expressed or coped with them differently due to their circumstances. A quirky tidbit about their enduring spirit is the evidence of small personal touches found in peasant homes: a simply carved wooden toy, a decorated pottery shard, a carefully mended piece of clothing with a decorative stitch. These small acts of creation and care, even amidst the grime and struggle, speak to a human desire for beauty and individuality that persisted despite the harsh realities of their lives. Even when you're living in a smoky hut with a pig, you might still want your spoon to have a little carved notch on the handle. It's the small things, right? Their lives offer powerful, if stark, lessons for us today. They remind us to appreciate the incredible luxuries we take for granted: warm homes, abundant food, clean water, readily available medicine, and the simple ability to flip a switch and have light. They show us the value of resourcefulness, of making do with what you have, of not wasting. And they highlight the fundamental importance of community, of relying on each other, of mutual support in times of hardship. We might not be helping our neighbors dig paths through snowdrifts with wooden shovels, but the principle of looking out for one another remains vital. As we drift away from the smoky hearths and drafty huts of the medieval past, leaving the scratchy wool and the taste of salted porridge behind, take a moment to just feel the warmth around you. Maybe you're snuggled under a soft blanket, maybe the heating is humming gently, maybe you just had a warm drink. These are the small, everyday miracles that medieval peasants could only dream of. Their struggle wasn't just against the cold, it was a struggle for every single day, for every single calorie, for every single breath of air that wasn't thick with smoke or damp. Their resilience is woven into the fabric of human history, a quiet testament to the strength required to simply keep going when the world outside your flimsy walls was trying its best to break you. The wind outside might be sighing softly now, not biting with frozen teeth, but just a gentle whisper against the glass. The darkness beyond your windows is just a night, not a vast, unknown threat filled with cold and hunger. The sounds you hear are familiar and safe, the quiet hum of modern life, not the rustling of animals in the corner or the creaking of stressed timbers. Your body is warm, your stomach is full, and you are safe. Let the echoes of their struggle fade now, leaving just a quiet admiration for the strength it took to survive, to endure, to hope for spring, year after year, through the coldest nights and more.